If you are aged 75 to 85 and you can still do these 6 things, you are one of a kind and you are sitting in the top few percent of health for your age. That is not me being kind to you. That is roughly what the data says, and by the end of this, we will have looked at the actual studies so you can see it for yourself. Quick word before we go any further. I am not a doctor. I have never treated a patient in my life. I am a retired biochemist who reads these papers most mornings because I find them genuinely fascinating. So nothing here is medical advice, and anything that matters to you belongs in front of your own physician. Here is the odd part. For decades, the general advice given to older folks has been to slow down, take it easy, and make peace with decline, as if it were a fixed appointment on the calendar. But a fair amount of the longevity research from the last 10 years or so points in a rather different direction. It suggests that some of what keeps people sharp, steady, and independent into their late 70s and 80s is not exotic, and it is not expensive. It is a handful of ordinary daily habits that a lot of people let go of somewhere along the way. Let me show you where this starts. Researchers at the Stanford Center on Longevity followed a large group of adults between the ages of 70 and 90 for about 12 years. What they reported was striking. The people who held on to 4 or more of the kinds of habits we are about to discuss were markedly less likely to run into what the researchers call accelerated functional decline. That is the fast slide, the one that takes away independence and moves someone into assisted living years earlier than they needed to go. Now I will say the honest thing here, the thing the headlines skip. This is an association. It shows that these habits travel with better aging. It does not, on its own, prove that one causes the other. But the association is strong, it is consistent, and it shows up again and again in different countries with different researchers, so it is worth your attention. Before we get into the list, let me tell you what is waiting at the end, because I know the temptation is to skip ahead. The number 1 item on this list, the most powerful of the 6, is not about diet or exercise in the way you would expect. Most people never hear it mentioned at a checkup at all. Researchers at Johns Hopkins have described it as one of the most underused things available to an aging brain that does not require a prescription. So do stay with me to the finish, because that one is worth the wait. And while you are here, I would love to hear from you. Drop your age in the comments, whether you are 68, 74, 81, or anywhere else, and tell me which of these 6 you think you already have. I read the comments on this channel. That is where a good deal of the conversation actually happens, and where I learn as much from you as you do from me. Right, let us count down from 6 to 1, starting with something so simple it sounds like it could not possibly matter. Number 6. Drinking water with a bit of intention, rather than only when you happen to think of it. Here is what changes with age, and it is real physiology, not folklore. As the kidneys age, they lose a meaningful share of their filtering efficiency. The thirst signal itself becomes blunted, which means the body can be genuinely short of fluid while the feeling of thirst never arrives. And the blood's job, carrying oxygen and nutrients to the muscles and the brain, gets harder as fluid drops. Picture the bloodstream as a delivery system running along a river. When the river runs low, the trucks slow down and parcels start going astray. That is a fair sketch of what steady, mild underhydration does to an older body. There is a study out of the European Journal of Nutrition, several thousand adults over the age of 70, and the people who kept their daily fluid intake up consistently showed lower rates of urinary tract infections, fewer falls, which makes sense because dehydration hits balance and reaction time, and better scores on short-term memory tasks. And that memory piece is not a surprise when you remember that the brain is roughly 3/4 water. Even a small drop in hydration shows up as measurable cognitive slowing at any age, and there is good reason to think the effect is amplified in later life when the brain is already working harder just to hold its baseline. Now here is what the people who did best in these studies tended to have in common. They did not wait until they were parched. They had a good glass of water first thing in the morning, before coffee, before breakfast, because the body loses fluid overnight through breathing alone, and you wake with a deficit already on the books. Then a little with each meal, and one in the afternoon. There is a wrinkle worth knowing too. The aging kidney has a harder time holding on to sodium, and without a little of it, plain water can run straight through without being drawn into the cells where it is actually useful. That is why researchers often look at fluid and electrolytes together rather than water alone. A pinch of good salt with that morning glass can help the water actually land where you need it. A woman wrote to me in the comments not long ago, 81, from Boise, describing afternoon fog, dizziness when she stood up, and a feeling that her thinking was wrapped in cotton wool. Nothing dramatic on paper, just a steady, mild shortfall of fluid over a long time. She mentioned it to her doctor, made a few changes, and wrote back weeks later to say it felt like someone had cleaned the windows of her mind, that her balance was steadier, and the afternoon fatigue had eased. Now, I cannot promise you that outcome, and I would never try, but it is a good picture of how quiet and how ordinary this one can be. My wife Ellen, when I read her that comment, said, "Translate that into English, Gordon," and the English is simply this: most of us are running a little dry, and it costs us more than we think. Number 5. Movement that asks your muscles to push against something a couple of times a week. Let me be clear straight away, because this gets misheard constantly. I am not talking about a gym and heavy barbells. I mean any movement where the muscle has to work against a force, a resistance band, a light weight, a push against the wall, carrying the shopping with a bit of purpose. The reason this matters so much later on comes down to something called anabolic resistance. Let me translate that. Anabolic resistance is the reduced ability of aging muscle to respond to the signals, protein, and exercise that tell it to build and repair. In plain terms, older muscle needs a louder signal to hold on to what a younger body would keep with half the effort. The muscle is not lazy, it is just harder to reach. And when it is not reached often enough, you get sarcopenia, the gradual loss of muscle mass and strength, which research from the Mayo Clinic has tied to a higher risk of falls, a greater chance of losing the ability to manage basic daily tasks within a few years, and a shorter life overall. It is one of the great silent thieves of independence, and almost nobody warns you about it in time. But here is the encouraging half. A study out of Tufts University followed adults in their late 70s and 80s who took up resistance training twice a week. After only 10 weeks, the participants showed real gains in leg strength and balance, and, the part that tends to surprise people, an improvement in insulin sensitivity, which feeds straight into energy, inflammation, and how the brain works. The mitochondria in muscle, the little power plants of the cell, appear to regenerate more efficiently when there is resistance in the picture. So you are not only building muscle, you are, in a sense, tending the energy machinery of the whole body. The people in these studies were not heroic about it. 2 or 3 short sessions a week, 20 or 30 minutes, working the large muscles, the legs and hips and back. Bands are popular in this research precisely because they load the muscle without hammering the joints. Timing came up as well, and here is the synergy point. The muscle's ability to take up protein for repair is a narrower window later in life, so a good serving of protein near the session seems to matter more than it once did. Move the muscle, then feed it. I will come back to protein because it earns its own place on this list. Number 4, keeping a steady, purposeful sleep schedule. And before I go on, if this is giving you something useful, something you wish a person had told you years ago, do take a second and subscribe. And if you know someone between 70 and 90 who ought to hear it, pass it along. That is genuinely why this channel exists, to hand seniors the plain version of what the research says, the part a short appointment rarely has time for. Right, back to sleep, because it is more involved than going to bed early. With age, the body clock, the circadian rhythm, shifts and weakens. The brain makes far less melatonin than it did in youth. Slow-wave sleep, the deepest and most physically restorative stage, shrinks considerably from what it was decades earlier. And that stage matters because it is when the body does a great deal of its repair work, when growth hormone is released to mend tissue and tend the immune system. But the piece most people miss is this: poor sleep in later life is not only about feeling tired. Researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, reported that older adults with disrupted sleep showed a higher buildup of amyloid in the brain, the same protein associated with Alzheimer's disease. Now I want to be careful and honest here, because this is exactly the sort of finding that gets oversold. That is a correlation, and the direction of cause is still being worked out, because poor sleep may drive the buildup, and the buildup may worsen the sleep. The researchers think it runs both ways, each feeding the other. Either way, sleep is not a luxury in this story, it is maintenance. The people who did this well were not sleeping more so much as sleeping consistently, to bed in the same narrow window each night, up at about the same time each morning, weekends included, because the body clock does not know it is Saturday. A cool bedroom, because temperature regulation during sleep gets less reliable with age, and a cooler room seems to support the deep stages. And a gap from screens before bed, though the researchers point out it is less about blue light than about mental stimulation keeping the mind switched on when it is trying to power down. There is a gentle add-on that shows up in the research too, and it is the synergy tip for this one. A few minutes of slow, deep belly breathing before bed nudges the body into its rest and repair mode, and studies link it to lower nighttime stress hormones, which makes the deep stages a little easier to reach. 10 quiet minutes. Nothing fancy, just the breath slowing down. Number 3. Eating protein deliberately and spread across the day. This is where I see the most stubborn misunderstanding, and it is worth correcting plainly. The old idea that you need less protein as you age has it almost exactly backwards. Because of that anabolic resistance we talked about, the aging body appears to need more dietary protein per pound of body weight than a younger one does to get the same muscle-maintaining effect. And yet a great many older people are eating rather less than they once did, often because appetite fades and starchy food is simply easier to prepare and to chew. Research published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, a large group of adults aged 70 to 85 found that those who took in more protein and spread it across 3 or more meals rather than piling it into one, held on to more muscle, had lower rates of hospitalization from fall-related injuries, and showed a better immune response to the ordinary infections that get dangerous at that age, the flu and pneumonia. Think of protein as the bricks the body uses to rebuild itself overnight. Every night, it tears down old, damaged tissue and lays in new. Short the supply of bricks, and the rebuild comes up incomplete. And over months and years, that shortfall becomes something you can see in a person's frame and feel in their grip. The spreading out part has a real reason behind it, and it is the synergy point here. Aging muscle can only make use of so much protein at one sitting for repair. Beyond that, the extra tends to get burned for energy rather than built into tissue. So 3 moderate helpings did more, in these studies, than 1 large one. Roughly a palm-sized portion of fish, chicken, eggs, Greek yogurt, or beans at each main meal is the sort of amount the researchers were describing. And pairing that protein with a little vitamin C, a squeeze of lemon, some pepper, a bit of fruit, helps with collagen, which is the connective tissue holding your joints and your frame together. A man wrote in from Scottsdale, 78, whose daughter had noticed he had dropped a good deal of weight that a previous doctor had waved off as normal aging. It was not fat he was losing, it was muscle. His grip strength, which is one of the better simple predictors of longevity in older adults, had fallen a long way. He worked with his doctor to rebuild his meals around protein, spread through the day, and months later he wrote to say he had carried all his own shopping in from the car for the first time in 2 years, and that he was proud of it in a way that took him by surprise. That is the whole game, really, carrying your own shopping, not turning back the clock, just holding the ground. Number 2, real, deliberate social connection, every day. I told you at the start that one of the top 2 would surprise people, and this is the one, because it sounds too soft, too emotional to belong on a list about the body. So let me be blunt. The research linking connection to health in later life is some of the hardest and most repeatable science in the whole field. A large analysis out of Brigham Young University, pulling together data on hundreds of thousands of adults, found that chronic social isolation carried a mortality risk on the order of smoking a substantial number of cigarettes a day. I will let that sit for a second, because it is a genuinely startling comparison. Being cut off, over the long run, appears to be about as hard on the body as a serious smoking habit. The National Institute on Aging has reported that loneliness travels with faster cognitive decline and a higher risk of dementia, and with raised inflammatory markers in the blood, the sort that wear on the heart, the immune system, and the connections in the brain. There is a plausible mechanism underneath it too. Real engagement, and I mean actual back and forth, not sitting in the same room as a television, prompts the release of oxytocin, which tamps down stress hormones and inflammation, and it lights up the parts of the brain that keep neural pathways busy and dense. Think of the social brain as a muscle. The circuits that fire during real conversation, shared laughter, a good disagreement, are the same ones that hold your memory and your sense of who you are. Leave them quiet for long enough and they start to thin out. And after 75, the brain is slower to rebuild what it lets go. Someone wrote to me about her mother in Charleston, 83, who lost her husband of more than 50 years and pulled away from nearly everything. Within a year, she had slipped noticeably on the standard memory checks. What turned it, the daughter said, was not a change in medication. It was a rebuilt week, a book club, a daily phone call, rotating through friends and family, a twice-weekly volunteer shift at the library. Months on, she seemed like herself again, sharper, and her inflammation markers had come down. And I want to be careful, because that is one family's story and not a guarantee, but the shape of it matches the research well. The prescription, if you want to call it that, is not complicated. Aim for one real, engaged, in-person exchange, a day where you are genuinely thinking and responding and laughing. A phone call counts if it is a real one. Passive company does not do the same work. And here is the synergy tip, and it is a lovely one. Pair the connection with a bit of movement, a walk with a friend, a class with other people, gardening alongside a neighbor, and there is a study from the University of British Columbia suggesting the combination lifts a brain protein called BDNF more than either one on its own. BDNF is about the closest thing the brain has to fertilizer for its own cells. You want as much of it as you can reasonably get, and it turns out the good company and the good walk together make more of it than either alone. And now, number 1. The habit that researchers at Johns Hopkins have called one of the most underused longevity tools an aging brain has without a prescription, and one that by most estimates, only a small minority of people over 75 actually keep up. Number 1, a daily, genuine cognitive challenge. And I mean something particular, not crosswords, though there is no harm in them, not passive reading. I mean the deliberate practice of learning something genuinely new, a skill, a language, an instrument, some form of making that pushes the brain into what I would call productive discomfort. Here is why it sits at the top. With age, the brain leans harder and harder on the pathways it already has. It gets very good at the familiar and quite reluctant to build anything new. That is not a flaw of character. It is an aging brain conserving energy by sticking to the well-worn roads. The trouble is that this same preference is how cognitive reserve gets spent down. Cognitive reserve is the brain's buffer, its ability to soak up age-related change and keep functioning well anyway. Think of it as spare capacity, like the memory in a computer. The more you have, the more the brain can absorb before any of it shows on the surface. The University of Edinburgh has run one of the great long studies here, following a large group of adults from their 70s into their late 80s. Those who kept up novel, challenging mental activity showed, on brain scans, a slower rate of shrinkage, better processing speed and memory, and a lower likelihood of a dementia diagnosis over the following decade. A separate project, the Rush Memory and Aging Project, found that people who described their daily lives as intellectually engaging performed, on standard tests, more like adults years younger. The mechanism is neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire itself by forming new connections. It does slow with age, but it never switches off. The brain keeps the ability to change well into the 80s, but only when it is given a real reason to. Learning a language lights up several regions of the brain at once, and work reported through the American Academy of Neurology has associated bilingualism with a meaningful delay in the onset of dementia. An instrument pulls together fine motor control, hearing, memory, and emotion in a way few other activities match. Even learning to cook an unfamiliar cuisine counts, because it makes you read, sequence, pay sensory attention, and use your hands all at once. The point is the struggle. Watching someone play the guitar on a screen is not learning the guitar. Sitting there with the thing in your hands, fumbling a chord, that fumbling is where the benefit lives. It is the mental version of resistance training. The resistance is the whole point. A man wrote in from Portland, 79, retired from a long career in engineering, who admitted he had spent his first few years of retirement doing very little that stretched his mind, and had started to notice names slipping and conversations getting harder to follow. He picked one thing he had always meant to try, oil painting, something he had never done, and he was, by his own cheerful account, terrible at it. 18 months on, he had finished a couple of dozen canvases, joined a local art group, which took care of number 2 on this list at the same time, and told me he felt sharper than he had in years, that following a conversation had stopped feeling like work. Now his story is his own, and I am not going to dress it up as proof, but it is a fine example of what the research keeps pointing at. Improvement, not merely holding steady, at 79. One more small note the research adds, and it is the synergy tip for the most important habit on the list. The brain builds its cell membranes partly out of a fat called DHA, the kind found in oily fish like salmon and sardines, and work from the Framingham Heart Study links higher DHA levels with a better brain response to mental training. In other words, it seems to help the brain take up the benefit of what you are learning. The seed and the soil, if you like. Feed the brain the raw material, then give it the challenge, and the two work together. Let me close with the honest heart of it. That stretch of life, 75, 80, 85, gets treated too often as a countdown, when the research keeps suggesting it is more of a continuation. The body and the mind hold on to a stubborn capacity for resilience later than most people expect. The 6 we walked through, sensible hydration, a bit of resistance, steady sleep, deliberate protein, real connection, and a genuine mental challenge, are not about turning back any clock. They are about making the fullest use of the time the clock still holds, carrying your own shopping, remembering the grandchildren's names without a list, and from everything I have read, it is rarely, if ever, too late to begin. If you are not subscribed, do that now, and turn the bell on so the next one finds you. And tell me in the comments your age, which of these 6 you feel strongest in, and which one you would like to build. I will be reading. That's what the evidence says. The rest is yours to decide. I'll see you next time.